The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that. Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. Okay, we're here at the American Atheist Convention, and I'm talking to Justin. I'm Bill the Christian, and Drew is not here for this convention, but we're going to have in the after show a little follow-up discussion between Drew and me about this conversation. And Justin is from Dallas, and Justin, glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and so we're going to be discussing, what's your biggest problem with Christianity? So where do you want to go with that?
So I think in the debate, the first step is there a God? The second step is, if there is one, what's his name and what does he prefer?
Yeah, right. It's a two-step process.
Yeah. I was raised in Christianity, and so I tried to square that with what I saw in the world. And God never spoke to me, and my prayers weren't answered, so I said, I must not be a good person. I need to try harder. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I read the entire Bible, and I took notes, and then I took those notes to a preacher. And at the end of that, what I discovered was that almost all of the questions are matters of faith, so-called, despite that some things are answerable by reality. Dinosaurs did or did not exist.
Empirically, I guess is what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So there were or there weren't dinosaurs, and they were or were not a test of faith to believe in them or not believe in them.
Right.
So you get further down that line, and again, you're questioning, all right, well, if there's a God, and we say it's the Christian God, what does the Christian God stand for? And presumably those answers are in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that the Christian God stands for, in my mind, are not moral. Mm-hmm. And if this is supposed to be the most just, the most loving, the most moral, then who am I if I am offering propitiations or my time and effort and money to something that I find immoral in certain circumstances? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
So I guess, I don't, not to put words in your mouth, but so you're, in one sense, your first big problem is that you felt like the two questions of is God real and what kind of God he is just sort of get blended together, as if God is real, then it must be the Christian God.
Yeah.
That was one of your problems, is that right?
Well, it's context specific. You're born here. If I was born in India, I would have been a Hindu, and that's that.
So let's talk about that one, and then we'll get to the moral one second. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? So so I would agree with you, meaning it seems to me that the question of is God real, is there a God in the sort of classical theistic sense, capital G God, if you want to say that, is one question. And then a secondary question is there a particular revelation of God on offer, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, some forms of Hinduism, that are more valid or have more credibility than the other ones? Or is it the case that there's no revelation and a person might be, say, a deist or something, or an Aristotelian? So I'm in total agreement that those are really two separate questions. And of course, C.S. Lewis famously, explored the question of God first, became a theist. He famously said, when he converted to theism, he was the most dejected theist in England or something, or all of England. So he wasn't immediately thinking, I'm now a Christian. He when Anthony Flew, are you familiar with him at all? Anthony Flew. So he was Britain's most famous atheist before Dawkins. Okay. So he presented a paper before C.S. Lewis at the Socratic Club at Cambridge. I think it was Cambridge, and he made an argument. He's a philosopher, and became famous for his argument, and then sort of became a very famous atheist. But in the early 2000s, he, in his elderly years, deconverted. Okay. So he abandoned atheism and became a theist, but not a Christian, or Muslim, or Jew, or anything like that. So he died believing in sort of an Aristotelian God, and so far as we know. So I'm in total agreement about that. And do you think most Christians aren't? Because I would tend to think that maybe a Christian might, on the surface, think those two things are the same. It's either Jesus or nothing. But that if a Christian had that explained to them, I would think most Christians would sort of agree. I mean, after all, C.S. Lewis is treated very, with great admiration and nobility, that he, as a thinker, a Christian thinker, or would you think a lot of Christians would sort of be in denial of that?
Well, it depends on if we're talking about the average Christian parishioner, or because they're not apologists. They don't read a lot of C.S. Lewis. Most of them don't even read the Bible. No, it's
true. I just meant, I would think if I explained that to fellow Christians, they would say, oh yeah, that does make sense. Or do you think most of them would sort of be, like in denial of that, even if you and I sat there and explained that to them?
I think most people who still go to church on a regular basis at this point in history really do believe that the Bible is true, the true word of the true God.
Yeah.
That there is no question about that fact to them. But of course, they've also never read any of the Bhagavad Gita, any of the Quran, so they're convinced that what they have is the truth.
Yeah.
And why question it? If especially if you've had a personal experience, those people are the hardest to convince otherwise. Even if you had a compelling argument, I'm not sure they would care.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so I think that part probably isn't going to be as big of a problem. I really do think the average Christian probably, if that was explained to them, and maybe you disagree, but I think most of them would say it does make sense at a logical level that God could exist, but you still have to decide which of the religions that talk about God are right, or all of them are right, or none of them are right. And certainly there have been a lot of people that everybody knows, like Thomas Jefferson, or someone like that have taken positions where they're not Christians in the normal sense. They believe in God. So let's talk about the moral one then, I guess.
Okay.
What would you pick out that you would say is something God did in the Bible, the Christian God? Now, of course, we have to differentiate that the Christians came along after the Old Testament scriptures or the Hebrew scriptures were written, so that Jews would not like it if a Jewish listener wouldn't like it if I'm equating the two, but certainly Christians identify with the God. They believe God, Yahweh, came in the flesh.
Yeah.
At least the second person of the Godhead came in the flesh in the person of Jesus. And so what would be something across all those scriptures that you feel like is a big problem you have?
Jesus said, I came not to bring peace but a sword. And that's Jesus meek and mild right there.
All right. So that's one big... So flesh out your problem. Like, what would be your problem with that? It might seem obvious to me, but I don't want to assume what I think I mean by that.
So it depends on how someone defines morality in the first place. If you define morality as whatever God commands of you, that is different than someone who has reasoned their way through morality and has a different... There's no title for what they think is moral and not moral. Okay. Like the closest I could say would be some sort of secular humanism or even secular Buddhism without any... That's kind of where my morality lies.
Yeah. Aristotelianism was like that too, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So
to some degree.
Doing unto others is a big part of that. But depending on God's mood, there's caprice, there's vindictiveness, there's punishment.
So that I came to with a sword, you're saying, is more of the sort of vindictive sort of morality that Jesus occasionally characterized Jesus' teachings. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Or take no thought for the morrow. Come to me and sell all your possessions. I can't directly quote it.
Well, let's talk about the sword one just for a second before we get too far from that. The first thing I would say in response, then you can tell me what you think of it, is I would think from a Christian perspective, it's not one or the other, whether we reason out morality or God simply has spoken and that's the end of it. That a Christian position is that both are involved. That God has spoken, and when He has spoken, a Christian takes those things absolutely as authoritative, but that a Christian nonetheless reasons out morality, not only in the sense that God didn't talk about everything, so you have to still reason out how these big ideas apply, but also a Christian tries to understand why God said certain things and not other things. Why did He emphasize certain values over others? And the command from Deuteronomy to love the Lord your God with all your mind is part of that. that you're to think and use your mind. So that's one idea. But even just about that one thing about sort of being vindictive. So I wouldn't think of that verse as saying that Jesus is vindictive in the sense of sort of Clint Eastwood or Liam Neeson coming back.
That's a warning. That to me, that's a warning to those who would stand in the way of his message. Mm-hmm. To me, he is saying, like, look, yes, we're here to do good things, but if you are in the way of our people doing good things, you are not good people, and good things will not happen. Right. Which to me, why would the most powerful being need to threaten anyone about anything? Yeah. It doesn't make sense. Or take a more modern example. So if I ask a Christian, how does your God feel about the entire continent of Africa? And how do you square the last 1,000 years of history of Africa with your God not being racist or hateful towards blacks? Because it doesn't make any sense that the most loving being who has the best plan just took a shit on a whole continent for 1,000 years, and then the only recourse you have in the Bible is the children of Ham are cursed with black skin. That's really, and now you're talking slavery apologism almost, And
I don't think that'd be the only way the only sort of recourse a Christian would have for trying to understand history or the history of Africa or something like that.
Even modern Africa, even if you wanted to make it just today, like the Ethiopians have constant drought. They're some of the most Christian people on the planet. Yeah. They have constant droughts. They're found dehydrated, dead in their huts, praying. Yeah. And God did not come for them. And you can say, well, God has a plan. But that's fine, and maybe there is a God that exists, but it's not the just, loving, meek and mild. And then if he's not truly just, loving, meek and mild, then is it right for me to worship that God even if it is real? And I would say no.
All right, so I think you've brought up, you've ultimately tapped into what is, I think, probably one of the best arguments against the existence of God. So just to be clear, that's where I'm coming from. But before we get to that, or back to that, I'd like to just talk about Jesus, particularly in his comment about the sword. I didn't come to bring peace. So obviously, since it's in the Gospels, we have to weigh it against the other things the Gospel writer presented. In other words, I'm a classicist, by the way. So I take seriously when you read a book, you've got to read the whole thing and weigh it against the other author's comments. And clearly in the Gospels, they don't think Jesus came solely to bring the vengeance, say, or revenge from God against humanity. His first comment out of the resurrection is famously, "Peace be to you." So whatever he meant by saying, "I didn't come to bring peace but a sword," is in the very gospel where Jesus still talks about the importance of bringing peace. That's part of his mission. He came to seek and save the lost and things like that. So whatever he meant has to be balanced at least against those other things. It also has to be balanced against what is like the central story, which you're obviously familiar with, which is that Jesus in the end died. That whatever he did, it's clear enough that the way the evangelists see it is that Jesus had the power. He could have called legions of angels down and created havoc and defended himself and whatever, and wiped out the Romans or the Jewish leadership or whatever. But the story is that he let people crucify him, and he allowed them to crucify him, right? He could have made it otherwise, and he chose not to do that. So, meaning, I don't think you disagree with that much, right? That he could have chosen...
Partially, but on a different basis than you might expect. So, you said that if Jesus wanted to, he could have called down legions of angels.
Well, that's a famous quote from him in the Garden, of Gethsemane, when he's getting arrested.
That is a non-falsifiable statement. That what happened is exactly what would have happened if he was lying about that, and there are no legions of angels because angels aren't real. So if you said, I chose not to call down the fictitious thing that isn't real, that's great. But I could say that too. Right now, I'm choosing not to call down a legion of giants to help me with this conversation. So
you would want a legion of Socrates, wouldn't you?
If he had have produced
philosophers or something.
If he had have produced some angels and said, "Don't make me call them back here. I'm such a nice guy, I won't call them back here," that would be a different thing. And the Romans kept hyper meticulous records. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they would have wrote that down. Just like the Bible says that everyone comes out of their graves in Jerusalem upon Jesus' resurrection. The Romans have no record of it, which is weird because you think that would be noteworthy that the dead are coming back to life in droves, and yet there's no record. And then the Romans also have record of 4 people named Jesus Christ. Different people. Only one of them was crucified. But isn't it strange that that was just a title for the leader of the Jews?
Yeah.
And only one of them, did they crucify as a criminal. But why don't we ever hear about the other 3?
All right, so first of all, you brought up a whole different topic. By the way,
Sorry.
do you ever read History of Atheists? It's an atheist who does a blog called History for Atheists. Tim O'Neill. Well, I think it's fantastic because A, he's an atheist. B, a lot of what Tim writes, I agree with. And so I don't think he would agree with your characterization right there about 4 atheists or whatever. So I just bring it up as interesting because he's an atheist, you may not agree with him, but I think he's worth reading. But let's go back to the original topic about what I was saying about the sword and the peace and so on. That I don't think that you would directly address that in your response. That that Jesus did actually die. The author clearly, all the evangelists think it's really, really important that Jesus died, and not all of them record that statement about the calling angels down. But I agree with your point that it's non-falsifiable and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not. I don't think that's relevant to what I was asking. My point wasn't whether we could know it was true he said it, but that the authors are presenting him as, and it's important to them that he could have right then, if he wanted to, bring angels down and wreak all this sort of violent havoc, and chose not to and died. So that whatever he meant by bringing the sword and not peace, he nonetheless didn't actually do that in the moment of his life. His mission was to come and heal the poor psychologically, economically to some extent, because he told some people to give their money to the poor, not everybody. And then, of course, to heal people physically and emotionally and spiritually and things like that. So my point is, the one initial criticism you brought out, it seems to me that he's sort of famous for the fact that he came and he had power, but he chose not to wield it to as a threat to sort of the Romans, but actually died. And then the gospel story is that is supposed to bring peace to people, and they can really have forgiveness and things like that. So how do you respond to that?
If we're talking about on balance, was Jesus an overall moral character? I would say yes.
Okay.
For sure. But we are talking about a book that should be perfect and 100% moral. There should be no moral failings to Jesus.
Right.
Ever.
So that,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So that one, in other words, the fact that he said that, even though he actually, you're saying that the fact that he said it was a moral failing. I'll bring the sword rather than the peace.
I would say, because if you're talking about the messenger of the most perfect creator of the universe, the message should be perfect.
Yeah.
Because, and then you get into authorship. You're like, well, we're flawed humans recording in a time where it's passed on.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, then I have no reason to believe it.
Okay. So that's not really a moral issue. That's more of a historical one at that point. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Whether it's actually historically valid.
Well,
it's not a particular moral.
I digress to that at the end of it, because
Yeah.
if you say on balance Jesus is good, I say Jesus should have been perfect. And that to me is a moral issue, that Jesus isn't perfect.
Okay.
Because
it's inconsistent with the message that he was God incarnate.
Yeah.
So am I right from what you're saying there that you think Jesus on balance is morally good, his teachings, but that he has some things he said you take umbrage with? Is that right?
Give no thought for the morrow to me is not a moral statement, because...
You mean it's an immoral statement?
Yeah.
Okay, rather than amoral. I got it.
That to me is not a good...
Okay, not a good, sensible way to approach life?
We did that. It was called Manifest Destiny. And then we logged the entire country, and we killed all the Indians. And, give no thought for the morrow. We won't need those trees.
Well, I think they were giving thought. That's the horrifying thing. So I wouldn't. Again, that's something where I would think it's sort of clear to me he didn't mean literally never think about tomorrow. First of all, because he himself actually talked about the future and had plans himself. He was planning to go to Jerusalem. He took steps to make his trip there. They were hungry, and so at one point his disciples were sent into a local city to buy food so they could eat. So it doesn't seem as though the authors are presenting his statement about give no thought to tomorrow as if like he meant you should never plan for something. If that's what you think he meant, I can't imagine they really thought he meant that.
Well, I mean, he was foreshadowing the actual apocalypse brought on by his father, right? So for him to say, like, this is all going to come to an end and I'm going to bring it to an end, that's why you don't need to have thought.
So that's what you think he thought that. Well, okay, so he certainly thought there was a coming judgment.
Yeah.
That it was tomorrow, I think that there's no place to indicate that. But he certainly talked about a judgment that's coming. And at times talked about it as if it seems as though it's coming soon.
Well, if you ask average Christians, do they think that this is going to happen in their lifetime? They say yes.
Yeah, well, that's true. I think there are some who think that and some who don't. But either way, that wouldn't be relevant to our conversation. His comments in the context of him talking about give no thought tomorrow is the fact that people overvalue material wealth, material possessions. They invest so much of their time and energy into things that are material. And from Jesus' perspective, there's an immaterial layer of reality which is eternal, and that it doesn't make sense to put so much value on the material things to the exclusion, or more so, to eclipse spiritual eternal type values. And that's why he was talking about the context of what he was talking about, that God is good and God by nature will provide for your material things, even if you're putting value on eternal spiritual things. In the context, he talked about how God clothed the lilies, the field, who don't work at all. But then he talks about how he fed the birds, which do work. And of course, there's it's not as though, the way I would describe Christian views on this topic and the way those teachings of Jesus seem to me to play out is that eternal things are more important. Inner soul is more important than your body, and so on. But there is a tension between how do you work that out, and that he's trying to give guidance on those tensions. And it's not more than that. It's not as though he's saying you should never think about tomorrow, literally.
So I would agree that a critique of materialism is a part and is one plausible way to take what Jesus has said contextually. Okay. But I think there are a multitude of ways to interpret, even in context, the way that Jesus was saying things. And because there are a multitude of ways, again, we're back to, is it moral for a God to not give us a clear enough... I should not be able to object to the teachings of Jesus if they're perfect and true. And why could God not have provided me something that was less subjective and more objective? Okay. Because there are other plausible interpretations of those statements. I'm not taking the plausibility away from your interpretation, because I think it is plausible. But there are multiple historical ways to interpret what's being said there.
So I agree. I mean, how could I deny it? There's people read the Bible and come to different conclusions. They interpret different things. Would you agree that some interpretations of ancient literature, say, or for that matter, modern literature, or the Constitution, some things are just wrong. People just misread things. Sometimes people have arguments which might sound good on the surface, but if you actually go back and read the historical documents, the way, say, how did the fathers understand the First Amendment, or the Free Exercise Clause, or the Establishment Clause, or whatever, gun rights, those sorts of things. I think we would both agree that some things have more historical... There's a lot... when you actually consider the historical possibilities, it's not quite as broad of a spectrum as people might think. And that's why I like Tim O'Neill, by the way, History for Atheists, because I think he cuts through some of the nonsense ways of reading the Bible and at least narrows the scope. And that people like N.T. Wright, N.T. Wright's pretty famous Christian historian, theologian, I think he and Tim O'Neill would actually agree on a lot of things, that because they've looked at the historical documents and they come to more settled conclusions. My response to you is that I don't really think of that. Our minds by nature are not themselves eternal, divine, perfect minds. God didn't make us, he didn't clone himself exactly. The Bible doesn't say he cloned himself. It's not Star Wars Episode 2. But rather God made us in his image, in his likeness, and we by nature weren't designed to be able to think exactly like him. We're supposed to have the capacity to grow toward God, but not actually be exactly ever God himself. So by nature, there's going to be a demand on a human being to exercise their sense of reason and try to grow toward the truth and toward goodness. And I don't see that as like problematic. In other words, I wouldn't see that as sort of fundamentally problematic. It's just part of the whole Christian story. But you're saying it's immoral that God even started with that design template?
How could the most loving creature create you and then allow the conditions, or sometimes cause the conditions, by which you cannot fulfill what he wants you to fulfill?
Well, of course, I don't think that. Like, I think that God has created the conditions so that we can. I think the Christian view is that God made us with the capacity to become fully, at some point, conformed to the image of Christ.
But now we're back to the classical argument, well, what if I was born a Hindu? It would not be my fault that I was born a Hindu, and I could be equally convinced and have spiritual feelings and those sorts of things. That's a classical argument. What about the guy born on the island by himself and never hears the name Jesus?
But the Christian view is obviously that guy has the same capacity, potential to become. It's not a capacity issue or a nature issue, that he's more familiar with Hinduism. Although obviously in India today, it's not like no one's ever heard of Christianity.
That's true.
But still, I don't think it's getting at my question of, are you saying the actual, I don't know how you could get away from, unless God literally clones himself and everybody has perfect minds and they are never susceptible to wrongly understanding something, so are you saying that's immoral that he didn't create people with that capacity?
He could cause, the most powerful being could cause every person to meet the requirements for heaven and send no one to hell. Then we get into the free will debate, where you say, well, you have to have free will to accept Jesus, but God has a plan.
Yeah.
So that's to say God's already decided which way you're going to go. Yeah. So what is the point of the praying? What is the point of believing or not believing? Right. All of that is predetermined. So if you have now you're at a point where there's a destiny or not a destiny, where did my free will go if God's already decided things? Right. And what is the point of the prayers and the propitiations if God already knows your heart?
Would you have a problem with the idea would you consider it immoral that God created, obviously God can't consult you on your creation. Logically, it's impossible. Do you see an immoral problem with God creates you and then gives you some space to be able to choose one way or the other whether you want to spend eternity with him? Do you think that model is immoral itself inherently?
So I would phrase it slightly differently. Okay. Is the model of choice immoral? No. Okay. Is the model of myriad choices that are impossible to make based on there being thousands of world religions, based on incomplete evidence, based on non-compelling evidence from the Iron Age. Yeah. I'm supposed to choose on that for my everlasting soul. Part's the part that's immoral. Yeah. So obviously I wouldn't as a Christian think that is the situation, but at the same time, I think it's a good place to end because it shows where there's a divide. I think we've had a lot to get into the divide. I can't wait for Drew and me to talk about this a little bit as well. And I don't want to really add to it. I think that's a good place to stop. And we never quite got back to what I gave you credit for, especially at the beginning where I said I think you're touching on what's called the Epicurean riddle, which is really the one, to me, is the best argument for whether God exists, which is I'll let other people look up the Epicurean riddle and try and learn something off of Wikipedia. Yeah. So really nice to have you. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me. And listen to the after show where Drew and I continue to discuss this issue for another 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
All right, so we're back. This is Drew with Bill to discuss the episode you just heard with Justin. And I thought Justin did a really good job of sort of, first of all, both of you at the beginning clarifying the question. So
it was helpful, very helpful.
You asked what his biggest problem was with Christianity, and right away y'all got into sort of maybe separating it into the is there a God question and is it the Christian God? So when you got into the sort of the specifics of is it the Christian God, is it Yahweh or however he attacked that, I think he said, his problem was with morality. It was a morality issue for Justin. At least that's the way I understood it. And so he talked about some things in the Bible that he thought were not right, maybe even immoral, that God was doing or saying or was being ascribed to God. And to me, he would come up with these, and you would sort of address them, and it kind of felt a little like whack-a-mole. It's like, well, how about this one? Well, how about this one? And I definitely feel like we can all be guilty of that, maybe even from both sides.
Yeah, of just sort of throwing whatever furniture we have at the door.
Yeah, just sort of throwing, kind of the kitchen sink arguments, and just maybe they don't even have to be consistent. I'm not accusing Justin of this. I'm saying I'm the same way.
Well, first of all, I think in one sense it's to his credit that he had a bunch to say. He had a number of things to say, at least.
He clearly thought about all of this.
And I'd also say this, though I do think he was a little bit of a sort of kitchen sink. There were some moments in there like that. At the same time, I'll just say this very clearly: I've absolutely done that myself, and probably will still do it at times.
Right.
Meaning, all of us at times feel just a little bit like, here's the next thing. If the first thing doesn't work as well. But I really just liked he was authentic and said this was a problem for him, and he said straightforwardly, this is why it's a problem. And I tried to address some of the particulars about the Bible, and it's a pattern I've seen. When I'm talking to atheists, is that it's very common for them to criticize Christians' understanding of the Bible, Christians not reading parts of the Bible, Christians basically just not knowing their Bibles well. But I do feel sometimes like it turns out both sides don't really know their Bible well. And that I sort of feel like,
it's a
he
problem.
said some things about that little statement about the sword and peace that are just so obviously wrong if you just read the context and read about. It's
very much about context, and we've all heard these things, whether we grew up in church or not. If you're an atheist and you've studied it, and things like not bringing peace but a sword, and in isolation, you can take that a number of ways. Is it a statement to the crux of his mission, or is it a statement of culture or of a kingdom that's coming?
Or who's he talking to? Even
but when
is he talking to the disciples?
But when you brought up the context, he's actually just talking to the disciples, and he's saying, "I'm going to have to go through a lot of junk. It's not going to be good."
Yeah.
And the lilies of the field is another example. And it's like he's not. I think the accusation was that God was saying, just do whatever you want. Don't worry about tomorrow. Death is better than life. And that's not the point. The point is don't worry. Well, you brought it up. Now I'm forgetting what the context even was. But
it just starts to sound like a lyric from a rock song rather than what Jesus actually meant to say. You can be treating it that way.
It becomes you can easily make it broader and more. You can put it in a light where it's a little harder to swallow, and it's a little more. You can be a little more critical of it as a moral thing.
But I agree with him that Christians also, I think it's true that Christians aren't reading lots of parts of their Bible, and Christians aren't thinking very carefully through the Bible and so on. It's just I think it turns out it's probably true of both sides.
Yeah, to be clear, that's definitely a problem for both sides. Because again, if it's that easy for an atheist to misinterpret or take in a different direction, and a Christian can do the same thing, and maybe even a little bit worse because they're trying to follow it.
Yeah. Sometimes in these conversations, Drew, I really do feel like when I'm talking to somebody, they'll give me a point of criticism of something Jesus said or something in the Bible, and my first thought is, it's this is going to go nowhere because I don't think they understand what this is. And I can think of like 5 others that would be much more difficult for me to have to answer. And I think this is just a part of just having an honest conversation. Like when you and I talk about things, I feel like I can say to you, the part that's really hard for me is this.
Right.
And I'm not just kind of waiting for you to throw something at me. I can just tell you what's honestly, I think, a really actually big challenge for the Christian, for someone like me to have to deal with, wrestle with.
Like the Epicurean riddle, for instance.
Yes, the Epicurean riddle is definitely...
So the problem of evil, which, I think Justin hit on a little bit, but you said at the end, y'all didn't really get back to, is one of the things that you and I have talked about the most, and that you have said is a real difficult thing to justify. And I think also really interesting about some other things that Justin brought up. At the very end, you started talking about what we always tend to get back to in our conversations, which is the grand design plan of God's, and then the idea of us having free will. And he took a different take than I do, and an interesting take that having free will is not a problem. Having the choice to make of do I want to follow God or not is not a problem. His problem was simply an evidence issue. He feels like he's being asked by God, if that's true, that he's being asked to make a decision on insufficient evidence.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that take.
Yeah, I think to me, that is a much more compelling argument. Just there's, as I think if I remember, he said essentially there's just too many options. Like it's okay that there's an option, but you've got a gazillion religions in different languages, a gazillion sacred texts, and it's just not reasonable that people can go sort of evaluating every religion and philosophy that's we've come up with, that's in the record of history, in order to make a reasoned judgment. Mm-hmm. And I can, to me, that has a little more teeth, and there's definitely something more to talk about. I don't take the view that it's quite so difficult, or that I don't myself think we have to sort of review all of history's literature and ideas and religions in order to draw some conclusions. And I actually don't think most people do anyway. I don't even think the atheists have actually usually evaluated carefully all the religions and every aspect of God that has been written by Xenophanes, the philosopher, before they decide they're an atheist.
Yeah, I wouldn't think it would be quite as incumbent upon them if they're not basing their life on their atheism.
Yeah, that's true.
But
I guess everybody's. Ultimately, we're all basing our lives on whatever our worldview is.
Yeah, well, I thought it was an interesting discussion.
I think that had some teeth, even though I would disagree. It'd be a whole other. You and I'd have to do a whole podcast on it. I disagree with how clear the evidence is and where the light is found. I don't think you have to have read the Quran to draw any inferences about the nature of God and what God's like and whether He exists and things. But at the same time, I do think that's a much better argument than some of the other things. Oh,
so I think, in fairness to Justin, what he was saying is not only that, but it's if you did grow up reading the Quran, if you grew up in that culture, if you grew up a Hindu or something, it would be very difficult for you to, sort of see the truth that you haven't been exposed to, or that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, I think it's true that there's no question. There's all sorts of factors that affect how you see the truth, but again, it'd be a whole other podcast for me to sort of explain why I don't think that's the right perspective on what the ultimate truth really is. But I do think it's a much better angle and question and challenge to Christianity.
Anyway. Well, the divide is a little tough in this one, but I think I do agree to some extent with Justin that that there are, and I think you would even agree, there are problematic things in the Bible that are hard to interpret, and come up with a reason for, and that leads to sort of this, from my perspective, this sort of lack of sufficient evidence. And so I thought he made some really good points about that. And of course, you would say the opposite. You would say that the evidence is sufficient and overwhelming to believe. So that's about. Would you agree?
I think that's about right.
Fair enough. All right.
All right. Well, I'm Bill the Christian,
and I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.